For years, many fans said there was no canon in Dragon Ball. I never understood this, but I just sort of agreed because it was the popular notion at the time. Then I began looking further into it and found out there isn't such a thing as canon because the word doesn't exist in the Japanese language. Instead, they use a phrase called official history, or Seishi. When I learned this, I decided to delve further in and discovered I was being lied to for years. You see, official history in Japan is just a phrase that is tangentially used in place of the term canon. We know this because canon means a collection or list of sacred books accepted as genuine. This was a term originally applied to make sense of the different books in the church and how they each related to one another. Because there were so many books that were debated, they chose only a certain amount to be accepted as the canon. This would solidify the official history of what actually happened according to Christians at the time. When relating this back to the Japanese term official history, many Japanese fans understand the concept that there is a single timeline in which a series of events take place. Because of this, it makes sense that whatever Toriyama is involved with and decrees official means it is now canon and takes place within his timeline following his original manga. With all this said, I want to point out that Toriyama's canon is one thing, but that does not mean it's the only canon. In the same way that the MCU canon and the Marvel Comics canon are completely different, I think it's also fair to say that there are multiple canons in the Dragon Ball franchise. Deciding which belongs to which canon is hard, but we can follow the word of Toriyama and Shueisha to help us figure out what is canon to his official manga. For example, when Toriyama was asked about his stance on DBZ movies, he said, "I take the movies as stories in a different dimension from the main story of the comic. I'm entirely just an audience member for them." Then, when he was asked what he did on them, Toriyama replied, "I check the plot and script that gets sent to me from Toei Animation. I also do some character designs and touch-ups as well as altering the names and such." Because of this, it's fair to say that something may be considered not part of the official history if all Toriyama does on it is check the script, do character designs, and come up with names. This would make a lot of sense considering his statement on GT, where he said, "Dragon Ball GT is a grand side story of the original Dragon Ball. It'll make me happy for us to watch and enjoy it together." In Toriyama's own words, he says, "For GT, all I did was just come up with the title and design the initial main cast and some of the machines and also do a few images." This lines up well with his prior statements on how uninvolved he was with the movies. Because of this, Toriyama saying GT is a side story is definitely fair to say it's not the official history of Dragon Ball or part of his canon. This next part is where things will start to come together, but also may get very tricky. After GT, Dragon Ball was on ice until Son Goku and his friends return, where the original story was written by Toriyama and then the script was written by Takao Koyama. I would argue Toriyama considers this OVA part of his official history because Tarble is referenced in both Battle of Gods and Dragon Ball Super Broly, both movies where Toriyama was heavily involved in the writing and most fans consider canon. Obviously, you're most likely familiar with the story of how Battle of Gods was the big comeback for Dragon Ball and that it was written by Toriyama. However, this is not necessarily true. The first script was written by Yusuke Watanabe, and then Toriyama got involved and rewrote much of the story. Because of this, it can be considered part of the official history. Toriyama considered as much when he was speaking in an interview about Resurrection F, where he said, "As with the last movie, I thought up the new story for the next Dragon Ball theatrical film as though it were a continuation of the manga when it was in serialization. Just the fact that I don't have to draw anything means I don't obsess completely over the smallest bits of dialogue." Well, the truth is that I wasn't planning on going that far since it's pretty exhausting at my age, but I got a little carried away. This time will of course be a continuation of the previous film, Battle of Gods. By literally saying he wrote the film as a continuation of his manga, it can be firmly placed in his official history. From this point, it should be clear that there is a canon in Dragon Ball, and it largely revolves around Toriyama's involvement and own words. But it's also important to note that Shueisha is also partly an owner of Dragon Ball, and their words also hold a degree of merit. According to the exhibit displayed at Tokyo's Skytrees exhibit, where a Dragon Ball timeline is displayed, the Super manga is displayed as having taken place after the original Dragon Ball Z manga concluded. According to Herms98, Super is described as the canonical sequel or legitimate sequel on the display in Japanese. Another piece of evidence for the canonicity of Super is in the December 2018 issue of Weekly Shonen Jump, where it says, "Popular characters from the Dragon Ball world are added to the canon by Akira Toriyama's hand." This ties back to what I was saying earlier about how the DBZ movies are considered Toriyama by non-canon, thus he is bringing Gogeta and Broly from the Dragon Ball Z movies into his canon with the Dragon Ball Super Broly film. With all this said, it should also be noted that with Super, there are two legitimate canons. There are Toriyama's 4 movies that follow up his manga, and there is also the Super manga following up his manga. In this case, Toriyama is still deeply involved with the manga arcs that are not adapting his movies, offering story outlines as well as designs, so it is probably best to say that while you can consider there being 2 different Toriyama canons, another explanation is that the movies are more canon than the manga where the manga adapts the movie. For example, you could say the Granola arc takes place before the superhero movie, and even though Toriyama was involved with the Granola arc, he was not that involved with the superhero manga arc. But he did work on the prequel and sequel arcs. Therefore, you could say the movie for superhero is more canon, but the prequel and sequel arcs are also canon. But this explanation gets very messy, so I think it is easiest to just establish there being 2 different Toriyama canons. With all this said, let's get into Daima. It was first developed as an anime-only story without him, but he got further involved until it was his own creation. This is very similar to what reportedly happened with Battle of Gods. Obviously, Toriyama was deeply involved with Daima, so naturally it should be considered part of his official history. However, while Toriyama and Shueisha have commented on the movies, GT, and Super, the only official word on Daima has been Toriyama's involvement in taking place after the Buu saga. It also does not overlap with Super in the timeline, so it would fit between Dragon Ball Z and Super. I think the simplest explanation for these contradictions is not that Daima is non-canon, but that Toriyama simply forgot. He was known to have a poor memory, something he has repeatedly said in interviews. Despite all this, Daima is still considered part of Toriyama's canon and should be accepted along with the contradictions in the same way that I established there are 2 different super canons, but there can also be 1 canon if you consider how involved Toriyama was. With all this said, the truth is, we can absolutely conclude GT and the DBZ movies are not canon or not part of the official history. We also know Super is Toriyama's official continuation of DBZ, but only the versions he was most involved with. We can also conclude Daima must be canon as well with its connections to Super. Its contradictions could easily be later explained, as Goku just forgetting Super Saiyan 4 as a joke, similar to how Piccolo forgot he could grow giant. With all this said, and all the references I've provided, it should be clear that while the Dragon Ball canon is not simple, an official history does exist according to its creators, thus debunking the lie that there is no canon, and that the Japanese do not have a concept. There is the concept of canon, but since they do not have the word canon, they say official history, which means the same thing. Thank you for watching. This is obviously going to be a very contentious video, and I expect a lot of conversation to be generated by this video, so please let me know what you thought in the comments below. Don't forget to also like if you enjoyed, and subscribe to keep up to date with all things Dragon Ball news and commentary, and I will catch you in the next one. Peace off.